The border does not shout, it breathes, a thin line of sand pressed between two restless worlds. Along the rim where the Maghreb leans toward the Sahel, the earth changes color without asking permission. Golden dunes slide into dark ridges of stone, and the silence that hangs over them says more than any treaty ever written. For years, this frontier carried its own quiet rhythm. Caravans moved, patrols watched, neighbors exchanged formal greetings while keeping their doubts hidden. But beneath that surface, a pressure gathered, patient, unspoken, inevitable, until a new Sahel rose with a different understanding of sovereignty, and an older Maghreb realized the ground beneath its influence was beginning to shift. Now the air along this border feels heavier, as if two memories of struggle are standing face to face, each asking whether the other still understands the language of dignity. Who decides what a neighborhood means when the neighbors no longer walk in the same direction? The map trembles. The northern edge of the Sahel has always carried a peculiar weight, not the weight of armies or declarations, but the heavier burden of expectation. For decades, Algiers stood at this crossroads, a capital shaped by its own long struggle, a state forged through endurance, a voice that once commanded respect across the Sahara. In countless stories told by elders and diplomats alike, Algeria was the place where difficult conversations found a room, where distant rivals arrived with guarded eyes and left with guarded promises. Its halls carried the echo of agreements that sought to calm a restless region. Its envoys traveled through dust and heat to remind neighbors that a broader horizon required patience, foresight, and the humility to meet halfway. The Sahel knew this rhythm well. Communities across the desert understood that when disputes rose, someone from the north would eventually knock on a door and ask for quiet dialogue. It was not a flawless system, but it was a familiar one, and in a land where familiarity often feels like safety, that mattered. Yet even as Algiers mediated, the winds across the Sahel were shifting. People far from its coastal cities lived realities that no conference room could fully capture. They moved across frontiers in search of work, water, or simply a sense of tomorrow. They watched local authorities struggle to match the pace of groups who understood the terrain better than any map. They saw promises signed in capitals but felt little change in their own villages. A mother in Gao who walked her children home before dusk did not measure peace by the thickness of a document. A trader in Agadez did not judge stability by diplomatic phrasing. A shepherd near the Hogar did not weigh security through communiques. They measured it in safety, in quiet nights, in the ability to travel without constant unease. And that difference between what was negotiated and what was lived began to widen. Meanwhile, across the southern belt, leaders who emerged from uniforms and uncertainty looked at their surroundings with a question that did not fade. Why must solutions arrive from beyond the sand when the problems are born within it? This question did not target Algiers alone. It was directed at every structure that seemed distant, every institution that spoke in polished tones while villages faced a harsher vocabulary. The rise of Burkina Faso within this new Sahel consciousness did not announce itself loudly. It arrived through a shift in posture, a declaration that the region must answer to its own voice, even when that voice unsettled familiar arrangements. Some saw it as bold, others as disruptive, but all recognized the message echoed far beyond national borders. Algiers watched, listening with the caution of a state that had lived through its own storms, a state that understood what instability could swallow, yet also knew the danger of appearing to dictate the tempo to neighbors who no longer wished to follow an inherited rhythm. Still, memories lingered, memories of times when Algeria's mediation had meaning, memories of delegations walking through its corridors with guarded hope, memories of agreements drafted under chandeliers while the desert waited for signs of calm. But the desert remembers in a different way. It remembers footprints more than signatures. It remembers outcomes, not ceremonies. It remembers who protects and who merely observes. As the Sahel shifted toward new alliances and new definitions of sovereignty, the centrality of Algiers began to blur, not disappear, but blur. Its role as the steady arbiter was no longer assumed. Its guidance was no longer sought automatically. Its influence, once firm like carved stone, now felt more like a pattern drawn in loose sand. To elders across the region, this change felt almost unthinkable, but to younger generations, it felt inevitable. They looked to leaders such as Ibrahim Traoré, not because of age or uniform, but because he spoke a language that aligned with their own appetite for agency, for dignity, for decisions forged at home. This did not make Algeria irrelevant, but it did make the region more complicated, a place where history and aspiration rarely walk at the same pace, which left one question lingering in the heat. If a nation built on resistance could lose its central place in a neighbourhood shaped by shared struggle, what does that say about the forces remaking the Sahel today? And the question lingered. The first cracks do not appear in speeches. They appear in the silence between two expectations, one that belongs to the past and one that rises from the ground beneath it. For years, the region lived inside a framework shaped far away from the dust. It was a framework designed to calm storms, to keep dialogue alive, to ensure that the horizon did not tilt too sharply. On paper, it offered a path. In practice, the footing was uneven. Communities across the Sahel had watched agreements come and go. Some promised reconciliation, some promised stability, but promises written in polished halls rarely reached the edge of the desert with the same clarity. When a pact is signed far from the source of the tension, the ink may dry, but the wounds rarely do. Village elders spoke of meetings they never attended. Local leaders described commitments they never saw fulfilled. Mothers, traders, teachers, imams, they all understood that a document is not the same as protection. Their measure of safety was simpler and far more stern. A safe road, a dependable well, a night without distant echoes that unsettled the heart. As this quiet skepticism deepened, something else was changing. Across the central belt of the continent, a new kind of political vocabulary emerged. It was not loud, but it was uncompromising. It questioned the wisdom of waiting for distant institutions to interpret the needs of a region whose challenges were carved directly into the land. This shift was not born in a single capital. It gathered force across borders. A shared sentiment that the Sahel must build a security model shaped by its own experience, not by inherited systems that no longer held. In this atmosphere, a new structure began to form, a grouping that did not seek permission nor wait for approval, a structure built on the idea that those who face the same storms should design the shelter together. It was more than a coalition. It was a declaration that the center of gravity in the Sahel was moving southward, toward leaders who believed that protection cannot be subcontracted and that sovereignty is not a favor, but a function. Algiers, long accustomed to being the quiet axis of regional dialogue, watched this shift with measured unease. Its diplomats sensed that the rules of the neighborhood were being rewritten without their hand on the pen. Its analysts understood that the dynamics of influence were slipping into a terrain not easily shaped by the methods of earlier decades. Still, many in the Maghreb hoped that the traditional structures could endure. They believed the region could be stitched together through experience, through memory, through a sense of solidarity that once felt unbreakable. But the Sahel had grown tired of waiting. It had grown weary of frameworks that promised balance but delivered hesitation. It had grown accustomed to making decisions under pressure, often alone, and often without the luxury of negotiation. This divergence between expectation and urgency, between tradition and reinvention, was not merely political. It was generational. It was emotional. It was historical. A young officer in one country looked northward and wondered why decisions affecting his people were still being shaped by committees whose understanding of the terrain came largely from reports. A market vendor in another country asked why decades of dialogue had failed to protect the road she used every week to feed her children. A teacher in a dusty town questioned why the same cycle kept returning, despite the many signatures that claimed progress. Such questions did not stay contained. They traveled through markets, through convoys, through gatherings under moonlit courtyards. They wove themselves into a new regional identity, one that demanded a fresh architecture of security. And when the Sahel finally stood together to express this new direction, the shift became undeniable. The neighbourhood had changed, the centre had moved, and the structures that once appeared permanent now looked like relics of a time that no longer spoke to the present. Then came a moment in the sky, a brief spark above a frontier, revealing just how fragile the old assumptions had become. And the question lingered. The moment that revealed the fracture did not come from the ground. It came from above, a brief spark across the quiet sky that carried more meaning than anyone wished to admit. Borders in the Sahara are often spoken of as lines, but they behave more like breath, shifting, expanding, tightening, depending on who feels threatened and who feels ignored. So when an aircraft glided near that delicate frontier, every side interpreted its shadow differently. To some, it was a routine search for clarity. To others, it was a step too close to a space whose ownership was always contested, even when no one dared to say it aloud. When the spark came, that sudden interruption of flight, it was not just metal falling toward the sand, it was trust collapsing in mid-air. Yet the deeper rupture happened afterward. For years, disagreements between the Maghreb and the Sahel were handled in controlled tones. Diplomats spoke carefully. Officials chose their phrases like craftsmen picking the right stone. Even anger had etiquette. But this time, the courtesy dissolved. The sky became a stage for accusation. Voices rose on one side, insisting the border had been breached. Voices rose on the other, insisting the incident was a message meant to restrain a security model that no longer followed old instructions. Each statement, however polite its wording, carried an undertone that could not be softened. It said, "We no longer see this frontier in the same way. We no longer see each other in the same way." In the towns scattered along the desert spine, people felt the shift immediately. A driver who carried goods between distant markets found his usual route slowed by inspections. A mother seeking medicine across the border noticed that the guards who once waved her through now studied her face more closely. A young man hoping to cross for seasonal work was told to come back on another day that never seemed to arrive. Nothing dramatic, just the slow tightening of a door that had once been slightly open. And then came the gestures, the withdrawal of representatives, the suspension of links, the reminders that nations, like individuals, sometimes retreat into themselves when hurt pride meets rising uncertainty. The language of diplomacy became a language of distance, not harsh but cold, not explosive but final. Algiers insisted that its intentions were misread. Officials spoke of safeguarding stability, of preventing escalation, of maintaining the balance that had guided the region for years, but their explanations, however rational, could not erase the feeling that the North was trying to supervise what the South now wanted to shape alone. In the southern capitals, this sentiment spread quickly. Some saw the incident as proof that old guardians were unwilling to accept a new structure of decision-making. Others viewed it as an attempt to remind the rising Sahel that influence does not vanish simply because a new coalition declares its voice. The truth, as always, was more complicated. Algeria was not seeking control. It was seeking certainty. Certainty that the region would not slip into chaos. Certainty that the ground beneath its own borders would not shift faster than it could respond. But certainty can look like interference to those who have just begun to stand on their own terms. The Sahel, already exhausted by years of insecurity, no longer wished to explain its urgency. It no longer wished to justify why it sought new partners, new methods, new definitions of protection. It wanted space, not as a rebellion, but as a necessity. The incident in the sky became the symbol of two competing instincts, a neighbor seeking predictability and a region seeking emancipation. Neither side admitted this openly, yet every gesture, every communique, every silent pause in official statements spoke that truth with painful clarity. And so the border hardened, not physically, but emotionally. The sand remained the same, but the meaning of that sand changed. People who once crossed it freely now crossed with questions. Officials who once met with ease now met with guarded expressions. Every movement felt heavier, as if the desert itself had grown suspicious. But perhaps the most telling shift was the silence, a silence that replaced the murmurs of cooperation with the quiet of unresolved tension, a silence that made even ordinary interactions feel like reminders of a deeper break that no one was ready to acknowledge. For in that silence, each side waited for the other to make the first step back toward understanding, and the question lingered. To understand the fracture, one must understand the two philosophies that shaped it. Algeria's worldview was forged through endurance. Its leaders grew up in the shadow of a struggle that taught them one lesson above all others. Stability is the last treasure a nation earns, and the first it can lose. From that memory came a doctrine: slow, deliberate, cautious, dialogue before pressure, balance before boldness, consensus before confrontation. A belief that a region survives not by racing ahead, but by keeping everyone on the same ridge of the horizon. In the minds of Algerian policymakers, the desert was not simply geography. It was a buffer, a breathing space, a zone where careful management could prevent the kind of turmoil that once engulfed their own mountains and streets. But the Sahel was shaped by a different experience. Its leaders rose from a landscape where certainty rarely lasted a season, where the distance between a calm morning and a shaken afternoon could be measured in heartbeats, where security was not inherited, but improvised, one decision at a time. Their doctrine was not written in long paragraphs, it was carved into daily survival. Act first, hold ground, trust those who stand with you on the front line, not those who watch from the edge. Do not wait for distant approval when danger refuses to wait for dawn. To them, the region needed reinvention, not reassurance. A new architecture, built not on inherited assumptions, but on the immediacy of lived reality. A structure that could respond to the wind, not merely observe it. The divergence between these two worldviews did not make either side unwise. It made them incompatible. One side sought predictability, a slow-moving order that would not collapse under its own weight. The other saw agency, a model that recognized the urgency felt by communities who lived closest to the shifting ground. From afar, analysts described this as geopolitics, but those who listened closely heard something more intimate, a disagreement over the meaning of responsibility. To Algeria, responsibility meant restraint. To the Sahel, responsibility meant decisiveness. Both spoke of protection, both spoke of dignity, both believed their path was the one that preserved the region's integrity. And yet, between these two convictions, a quiet distance widened. Behind closed doors, conversations grew heavier, not hostile, simply strained. A tone that suggested admiration for the past, but impatience with the present. A tone that revealed respect, but also fatigue. The fracture did not come from anger. It came from the realization that the two sides were no longer traveling toward the same destination, and the question lingered. The border between the Maghreb and the Sahel has always been more than a frontier. It is a threshold, a place where people move, where stories cross, where uncertainty gathers its strength before stepping into the open. But in recent years, that threshold has hardened, not through walls or fences, but through suspicion, through the quiet realization that two neighboring regions are no longer carried by the same current. To the north, officials speak of preservation. They look at the desert as a fragile membrane separating stability from strain. Every shift that occurs beneath that membrane is watched carefully, measured against the memory of a past they refuse to relive. To the south, officials speak of transformation. They see the same desert as a future waiting to be reclaimed, a corridor where new alliances, new security designs, and new forms of cooperation must be built from the ground upward. These two visions do not always contradict each other, but they do not align. On the ground, the effects accumulate quietly. A traveler who once crossed the border without hesitation now finds questions waiting at each checkpoint. A merchant following her familiar route feels the weight of new procedures she does not fully understand. A young man hoping to move northward for work discovers that intent alone is no longer enough to guarantee passage. The desert absorbs these stories without judgment. But the people living within it feel every shift as if the sand beneath their feet were tilting ever so slightly. Meanwhile, the two regions drift apart in ways that maps often fail to show. The Maghreb faces outward, toward deep water ports and the distant lights of foreign markets. The Sahel faces inward, toward the heart of the continent and the belief that its future must be authored from within. These orientations are not hostile. They are simply different, born from distinct memories, distinct pressures, distinct expectations. Yet difference alone does not create fracture. Fracture emerges when difference is left unattended. There remains a chance for the neighborhood to rebuild its rhythm. Through dialogue that acknowledges the urgency of one side and the caution of the other. Through cooperation that respects the realities of the desert's edge and the aspirations of those who refuse to be defined by the past. But every region reaches a moment when hesitation becomes more costly than the risk of change. And the question now is simple and heavy. Will this border become a bridge or a boundary in the years to come? And the question lingered. The border waits, not for permission, but for understanding. Along the vast seam where the Maghreb leans toward the Sahel, the wind carries two memories of struggle. One shaped by earlier battles for self-determination, and one shaped by the present demand to define security on new terms. For decades, Algeria believed the neighborhood could be guided by experience alone, that patience, caution, and historical memory were enough to steady the horizon. And for long stretches of time, they were. But the Sahel now stands on a different threshold. It speaks with the voice of a generation that refuses to wait for distant approval. A generation whose leaders, including figures like Ibrahim Traoré, insist that dignity must be claimed, not granted. To many across the continent, this rising Sahel does not erase history. It honors it by continuing the unfinished work of shaping a future free from dependency. In markets, in border towns, in quiet villages half hidden by sand, people sense that the region is shifting. They may not read the statements, but they feel the consequences, the tension at checkpoints, the hesitation in officials' eyes, the way a familiar crossing now asks unfamiliar questions. The challenge is no longer only political, it is emotional, it is generational, it is the challenge of reconciling two different rhythms of sovereignty. Algeria seeks steadiness, the Sahel seeks agency, both seek safety, but approach it from distant angles of the same sky. Somewhere between them lies a truth that no side has fully spoken. A neighborhood cannot endure if its members face each other as strangers. And so the question returns, soft, persistent, unavoidable. Can dialogue be rebuilt between a state shaped by long memory and a region reshaped by new conviction? The answer may depend on whether this shifting Sahel, led in part by voices like Ibrahim Traoré and anchored by nations such as Burkina Faso, can find common ground with a Maghreb that still sees itself as guardian of the Northern Gate. For borders are not fixed by lines, they are fixed by trust. What kind of neighborhood will this frontier choose to become? Stay with this story. Its next chapter belongs to those who dare imagine a different way forward.